The last room in Olivia's cleaning routine was always the hardest, the nursery. There, the scent of baby powder and freshly laundered clothes was a torture to her soul. Every silent toy, every stuffed animal with button eyes seemed to stare at her with an accusation. It had been only 6 weeks since she had set up a room just like this one, full of dreams and hopes for a son who never got to inhabit it. Now, she cleaned the sanctuary of another child, a boy who had everything except the warmth of a mother. The silence of that room was more deafening to her than any noise, a constant reminder of the emptiness she carried in her chest. That evening, the owner of the house, Arthur, entered the room for his nightly farewell, a cold and brief ritual. He stood beside the crib, but didn't pick up his son. He merely observed little Theo for a moment, a painful formality. "Amanda, I'm leaving for dinner now. Make sure he doesn't get too fussy," he said to the nanny, who responded with a nod. Without taking her eyes off her phone, Olivia, who was finishing cleaning the glass on the balcony, felt a chill. His words were not those of a father, but of a manager delegating a task. The house was a corporation, and the baby, an asset that needed to be managed with minimal noise. As soon as the front door closed, the atmosphere changed. The nanny, Amanda, prepared the baby's bottle with visible impatience, muttering under her breath about how needy the child was. Theo, sensing the coldness in her touch, began to cry. Amanda placed him back in the crib with a harshness that made Olivia's heart ache. "Now go to sleep," the nanny said, before leaving the room and closing the door, letting the baby's cries echo down the hall. Olivia, from downstairs, heard every sob, and each one was like a needle piercing her skin, awakening the pain she tried to numb with work. The hours dragged on, and the crying didn't stop. It became the mansion's soundtrack, a constant lament that no one seemed to want to hear. For Olivia, however, it was impossible to ignore. The sound activated memories, the phantom sensation of her own son in her arms, the scent of his skin. Her body, still in mourning, reacted. A familiar, aching pain in her breasts was a cruel reminder that she was a mother without a child, a source of nourishment with no mouth to feed. She tried to focus on her cleaning, but Theo's cries were intertwining with her own grief, becoming a single, unbearable cry for help. Driven by a growing anguish, she quietly went up to the second floor. She found Amanda in the kitchenette, laughing on a video call, completely oblivious to her duty. "He won't stop crying. He's a nightmare," she was saying to the person on the screen. At that moment, Olivia noticed something terrifying. Theo's cry had changed. It was no longer a loud protest, but a faint, intermittent whimper, the sound of surrender, the sound of a small body giving up the fight. It was this near silence that finally broke through all the barriers of professionalism and fear that had contained her. The real danger wasn't in the noise, but in the quiet that followed it. She walked past the nanny like a ghost, her heart hammering in her chest, and entered the nursery. The scene hit her like a physical blow. Theo was pale, his lips dry, his breathing shallow. He was feverish and clearly dehydrated. Without thinking, she picked him up. The contact of the baby's hot, fragile skin against hers was electric. In his delirium of hunger and exhaustion, little Theo, feeling the warmth of a human body, did what nature commanded him to do. He began to desperately root for food at Olivia's chest, his small mouth moving with an urgency that broke her heart. That primitive, desperate gesture was the spark that caused the explosion. Olivia's pain over the loss of her son, the frustration of her body still producing milk, and the suffering of that abandoned baby converged into a single, unbearable point. It wasn't a rational decision. It was a visceral reaction, an act of pure compassion that defied all social norms. She wasn't an employee in that moment. She was a mother, answering the call of a child who was dying. Instinct, stronger than any rule or fear, took complete control of her actions. She sat in the armchair, her heart racing, and settled the small, trembling body in her arms. With shaking hands, she guided him and offered him her breast. Theo latched onto her with surprising strength, and the sound of his hungry suckling was the only noise in the room. The crying stopped instantly. A deep, sacred peace descended upon the room, a silence that was not of absence, but of pure contentment. Silent tears streamed down Olivia's face, a mixture of pain for her own loss and relief at being able to soothe the suffering of this tiny being. It was at that exact instant that the bedroom door opened. Arthur, who had returned early, had followed the unusual silence to his son's room. He stopped in the doorway, and the scene before him defied his comprehension. The housekeeper, a stranger, sitting in his armchair with his son in her arms, in an act of profound and shocking intimacy. His face became a mask of disbelief, which quickly twisted into fury. What was this? An act of unimaginable compassion, or the most unforgivable of violations? In that moment, the lives of 3 people were about to change forever. An act of pure maternal instinct that breaks all the rules. Was it a miracle or a crime? If this scene impacted you and made you curious, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to find out the consequences of this powerful moment. Also, send a message of support to Olivia and little Theo, who found solace in each other. Arthur's voice cut through the peace of the room like a fire alarm. "What the hell do you think you're doing in here?" The fury on his face was that of a king finding a commoner on his throne. His mind, conditioned by rigid social barriers, registered the scene not as an act of salvation, but as the most intimate of transgressions. A stranger, the cleaning lady, with his son at her breast. The image was so shocking, so outside the rules of his orderly world, that rage was his only possible reaction. He moved forward, ready to snatch the baby from her arms, to throw her out, to erase this profane scene from his house. Instinctively, Olivia's first reaction was not to cringe in fear, but to protect the child. She turned her body, using herself as a shield to protect little Theo from his father's fury. "Careful, he's sleeping," she whispered, her voice firm despite her racing heart. It was the sight of his son that stopped Arthur in his tracks. For the first time in his 2 months of life, Theo was sleeping a deep, serene sleep in someone's arms, a small, satisfied curve on his lips. For 60 days, that baby had been a bundle of tension and tears. And now, there he was, at peace. The contradiction was so powerful. It disarmed Arthur's rage, leaving in its place a stunned confusion. As he looked at his peaceful son, Arthur's mind was assaulted by a memory. The day of Theo's birth. The joy of holding him for the first time, immediately crushed by the news that his wife, Beatrice, had not survived the complications of childbirth. Life and death had arrived in the same sterile hospital breath. Since then, he couldn't look at his son without seeing the shadow of the wife he had lost. The crib was a reminder of the casket. The baby's cry was the echo of his own grief. The love he felt was encapsulated in a pain so deep that he didn't know how to touch it without getting hurt. Unable to cope with this duality, Arthur did what he did best. He managed the problem. He took refuge in his work, the only place where logic and control still made sense. He hired the most expensive nanny, bought the best products, and assembled a nursery that was a technological masterpiece. He provided everything money could buy, hoping that structure and professionals could fill the void of his own absence. He outsourced affection, delegated fatherhood, turning his son into just another department of his life that was supposed to run smoothly without causing him trouble, without bringing him more pain. "I lost my son, sir, 6 weeks ago." Olivia's confession, spoken in a breath of a voice, broke the silence and brought him back to the present. The sentence hit him with the force of a punch. He stared at her, and for the first time, he saw the woman behind the uniform. She told him briefly about her own newborn, about the medical malpractice that had taken him, about the dream of a life that had turned to dust. The pain in her voice was so recent, so raw, that it resonated with his own. She wasn't making an excuse. She was sharing the key that unlocked the door to her incomprehensible act. She continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength as she revealed the second layer of her tragedy. She told him about Victor, her husband, the man who was supposed to be her safe harbor, but who became her tormentor. Instead of comfort, he blamed her. He called her weak, said she hadn't taken care of herself during the pregnancy, and abandoned her at the height of her grief. Overnight, she found herself without a son, without a husband, and without a roof over her head. Her grief was compounded by the cruelest of betrayals, leaving her utterly alone to navigate an ocean of pain and despair. Without a single lifeboat in sight, the job at Arthur's mansion hadn't been a career choice. It was an act of pure survival. She came there to clean up other people's messes while desperately trying not to drown in her own. Every hallway she scrubbed, every window she wiped, was a small battle against despair, an effort to keep her head above water, to keep breathing. She didn't expect to find connection or compassion in that cold, silent place. She only hoped for enough to pay for a rented room and a plate of food, enough to keep existing until the pain, perhaps, became a little less sharp. The two confessions, hers and his, now hung in the air between them, invisible, yet heavy. Arthur looked at her, and the image of the housekeeper dissolved, replaced by the image of a fellow mourner. He too had lost his partner. He too was raising a child alone. Though their worlds were separated by a chasm of privilege, they were united by the universal geography of loss. In that instant, his anger morphed into a bewildering empathy. She wasn't a stranger violating his space. She was a mirror of his own lonely hell. The storm of emotions left them both exhausted. The situation was too intimate and complex to be resolved with a firing or an order. "Go home, Olivia," Arthur said, his voice tired. "We'll talk tomorrow." With infinite care, she transferred the sleeping baby into his father's arms. For the first time, Theo didn't stir, didn't cry. He just kept sleeping, secure. Olivia left, not knowing what her future held, but with her soul strangely at peace. And Arthur was left alone, for the first time holding his son in a state of calm, a gift from a stranger whose pain he was now beginning to understand. The next morning, the nanny, Amanda, returned from her fabricated emergency. She entered the mansion expecting to find the chaos that justified her high salary. A crying baby, a house in disarray, and a boss on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Instead, she found a disconcerting peace. Arthur was in the living room, and on his lap little Theo was babbling and smiling, something Amanda rarely saw. The scene, which for anyone else would be a relief, was a threat to her. The tranquility of that house was a direct danger to her comfortable job and her position of control. Amanda's job was easy and well paid precisely because Theo was a difficult baby and Arthur was an absent father. The sudden harmony between father and son made her presence almost redundant. Driven by a cold envy, she needed to understand what had happened. She went to the kitchen, where she found the head housekeeper, Flora, who, with a heart full of admiration, told her about Olivia's compassionate act the night before. She told her how the cleaner, moved by her own grief, had calmed and fed the desperate baby. To Flora, it was a miracle of empathy. Amanda, however, didn't hear a story of heroism. In her cynical and calculating mind, the narrative was instantly rewritten. She didn't see a grieving mother saving a starving child. She saw a competitor, an unstable, lower-class woman who, after losing her own child, had developed a dangerous obsession with her boss's son. The act of breastfeeding, which for the housekeeper was a gesture of pure generosity, was for Amanda proof of a transgression, a violation of boundaries she could use to her advantage to eliminate the new, unexpected threat. With an expression of false concern, She began to sow the poison. "But Flora, that's terribly inappropriate," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "A woman in that state of grief. She could be unstable. What she did was a violation of Mr. Arthur's and the baby's privacy. We need to be careful." She skillfully reframed Olivia's act as a symptom of imbalance, painting her not as a savior, but as a potential danger. She knew that in their world, prejudice was a far more powerful weapon than gratitude. Her next step was to take the poison. Outside the mansion walls, she made a call to Caroline Ashford, the most connected and gossipy socialite in the late Beatrice's circle of friends. "Caroline, darling, I have to tell you something awful that's happening at Arthur's house," she whispered into the phone, her voice thick with rehearsed panic. "It's about the new cleaner. The woman is completely unhinged." She skillfully narrated her distorted version of the facts, omitting her own neglect and the baby's desperation, focusing only on Olivia's bizarre and transgressive act. "She breastfed him, Caroline. By force," she lied, adding a touch of cruelty to the story. "I'm sure she's trying to seduce Arthur, taking advantage of his vulnerability to take our dear Beatrice's place. She's the worst kind of opportunist, using her own tragedy to infiltrate the family." The scandal was perfect. It involved a rich, vulnerable widower, a poor and supposedly deranged employee, and an act that, out of context, sounded like a shocking violation. The story was irresistible, a delicacy for high society's voracious appetite for drama. The rumor spread like wildfire. Within hours, Arthur's phone began to ring incessantly. It was his late wife's friends, neighbors from the gated community, even his mother-in-law, all reciting the same script poisoned by Amanda and amplified by Carolyn. The voices, disguised as concern, were unanimous in their judgment. They spoke of protecting Beatrice's memory, of Theo's well-being, of how a woman like Olivia was unstable, inappropriate, and an opportunist. Each call was a new blow, another wave in the gathering storm of prejudice. Arthur found himself trapped on an invisible battlefield, torn between two opposing realities. On one side, the evidence of his own eyes. His son, once a well of sadness, now smiled, babbled, and followed Olivia with a look of pure adoration. Theo was, undeniably, happier and healthier than ever before. On the other side, there was the deafening judgment of his world, a chorus of voices accusing him of naivety, of weakness, of disrespecting his wife's memory by allowing a nobody to get so close to his son. The external pressure began to erode the gratitude he felt. The wound of Beatrice's death, which he believed was partly caused by negligence, was still raw, and the fear of making another mistake, of failing to protect his family again, paralyzed him. The world was telling him he was wrong, that his intuition was a trap, that the peace he saw in his home was a dangerous illusion. Doubt, once planted, began to take deep root in his tired soul, poisoning the only source of joy he had found in months. It was Amanda, the nanny, who delivered the final blow. With a performance worthy of an actress, she approached Arthur at the end of the day, her face a mask of loyalty and concern. "Mr. Arthur," she said, her voice low, "Olivia asked me to stay later today. She said Theo needs her to sleep well." She paused dramatically, planting the final seed of doubt. "I found it a bit strange. After all, she's not his mother, is she? But sometimes she acts like she is." The insinuation was subtle, but lethal. It framed Olivia's love not as a gift, but as an appropriation, a usurpation of Beatrice's place. For Arthur, already besieged by external pressure and his own ghosts, Amanda's observation sounded like the confirmation of his worst fears. The image of his smiling son began to be overshadowed by the fear of scandal, by the dread of being deceived again. The peace he had felt for a brief moment shattered, replaced by the old, familiar mistrust. He was about to make a terrible mistake. That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He replayed the scene in his mind. Olivia, a stranger, breastfeeding his son, and he heard the voices, obsession, opportunist. For Theo's sake, the pressure of the world became stronger than the truth he saw in his own home. And then he made his decision to protect his wife's memory, to silence the voices, to do what the world expected of him. He would do the unthinkable. He would silence the one person who had brought joy back into his son's life. The storm of prejudice was about to destroy a pure bond. The next morning dawned with a deceptive beauty. The sun streamed through the mansion's windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and creating patterns of light on the marble floor. Olivia was in the living room, sitting on the rug, playing with Theo. The baby, who now sat up, firmly, giggled every time she hid her face and reappeared. It was a pure sound, a melody of happiness that had become the new soul of that house. For a brief moment, in the middle of that bubble of joy, Olivia allowed herself to forget that she was an employee, that this was not her son. She allowed herself to just be happy, not knowing she was living her last moments of peace. The summons came over the intercom, Arthur's voice, cold and devoid of any emotion. "Olivia, to my study. Now." This formality in his tone was like a bucket of cold water. The warmth of the moment dissipated, replaced by a knot of apprehension in her stomach. She asked Flora to stay with Theo, gave the baby a long kiss on the forehead, and walked toward the study. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if she were walking to a courtroom, not knowing what crime she had committed, but certain she would be condemned. The hallway, once just a space, now felt like death row. The study was dark, the heavy curtains drawn, blocking out the sun and the morning's joy. Arthur stood with his back to the door, looking out at the city through the panoramic window. He didn't turn when she entered. He left her standing in the middle of the room in a calculated silence, a power play to reassert who was in charge, to remind her of her place. Olivia waited, her heart beating erratically, trying to decipher the tense silhouette of the man who, the night before, had looked at her with admiration and who now treated her with the distance of an executioner. She felt that the world she had known for the past few months was about to crumble. He finally turned, but his eyes didn't meet hers. His face was a mask of coldness. "People are talking, Olivia," he said, his voice flat. "They say you're taking advantage of my vulnerability, that your affection for Theo is an obsession, a consequence of losing your own son." He delivered the words as if he were reading a report, the world's cruel accusations now coming from his mouth. He wasn't asking if it was true, he was stating it, using the anonymous shield of people to deliver the blow, washing his hands of responsibility for the brutality. The accusation was so monstrous, so surreal in its malice, that Olivia felt the air leave her lungs. To have her most sacred pain, the grief for her son, used as a weapon to paint her as an unhinged and dangerous woman, was a violation that left her speechless. She looked at Arthur, searching his eyes for a trace of the man who had cried with her, who had shared his own pain. But he wasn't there. In his place was a stranger, a billionaire protecting his empire, willing to sacrifice the truth to appease the fears of his social circle. The disappointment was almost as painful as the accusation itself. He continued, relentless. "What you did, the act of breastfeeding my son, was inappropriate. It was a breach of all boundaries. It's causing gossip, problems. It's destabilizing the life of my family and, most importantly, Theo's." With a twisted logic, he took her purest act of compassion and turned it into the source of all the conflict. He was no longer just repeating the venom of others. He was validating it, making it his own. He was using her love as the primary evidence of her supposed crime, blaming the savior for the storm that others had created. And then he delivered the final sentence. "I cannot have this kind of instability in my house." The pause he took was laden with a coldness that froze Olivia's soul. "Your employment here is terminated. You're fired." The word echoed in the silent room. It wasn't just the loss of a job, it was expulsion from paradise, the loss of a home, a purpose, the boy she had learned to love as her own. It was the most absolute rejection, an exile decreed by the man she, in her naivety, thought would protect her, would understand her. To seal the cruelty, born of his own weakness and fear, he added the final blow. "And don't expect a letter of recommendation," he said, turning his back on her again. "I cannot, in good conscience, recommend someone who acts so impulsively and inappropriately." He wasn't just firing her, he was branding her, condemning her. He was ensuring that other doors would close to her, punishing her act of love with professional and social isolation, a sacrifice on the altar of public opinion. The message was clear: people like her should not dare to love outside of their place. Crushed, humiliated, and with nothing left to lose, Olivia made one last desperate plea, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Please, sir, just let me give Theo one last kiss goodbye." It wasn't the request of an employee, but the plea of a mother. She wasn't asking for money, for justice, for a retraction. She was asking only for one last moment of love, one last chance to say goodbye to the child who had become the center of her wounded universe, the reason for her fragile joy. One last, simple act of affection before being cast back into the darkness. "No," Arthur replied, his back still to her, unable to face the pain he was inflicting. "It would only confuse him more. It's better if you leave now, quietly." The refusal was the final act of his cowardice. He was so terrified of his own emotions, of the truth of the bond she and his son shared, that he denied them a human farewell. He chose a clean, brutal amputation over a compassionate goodbye, all in the name of a protection that was really just an escape from his own feelings and his own responsibility. Olivia left the study feeling as if her soul had been torn from her body. As she walked through the luxurious hallways for the last time, the sky outside, once bright and sunny, suddenly darkened. A storm was brewing on the horizon, a mirror of the turmoil in her heart. She picked up her small bag with her few belongings. None of the other staff dared to meet her gaze. They knew what had happened. The injustice hung heavy in the air. She walked out the front door, a lonely figure swallowed by the beginning rain. From his study window, Arthur watched her disappear into the curtain of water. At the exact instant the mansion gates closed behind her, a new sound rose from the floor above. It began as a confused whimper, then grew into a cry, and within seconds it exploded into a high-pitched, inconsolable scream. It was Theo. Somehow, on some primitive level, he felt her departure. The silence in the mansion had been broken. The peace Olivia had brought was gone with her, and the sound of suffering, which Arthur thought he was silencing, returned with overwhelming force, the first echo of his own terrible mistake. Arthur has hit rock bottom and now needs to fix his terrible mistake. A journey of redemption is about to begin. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it, and comment, have you ever had to make a tough decision to fix a mistake you made? Olivia's exile began with the rain and continued under the cruel sun of indifference. In the days that followed, she searched for work with what little energy she had left, but doors closed in her face. The lack of a reference from a family like Arthur's was a stain on her resume, a red flag that made her unemployable. The gossip, even whispered, had become an invisible wall, condemning her to unemployment. The little money she had saved ran out like sand through her fingers, and soon the eviction notice arrived. In a matter of days, the woman who had brought life to a mansion was utterly destitute. With her few belongings in a plastic bag, she found herself, for the first time in her life, without a roof over her head. The nights were a terror of cold and fear, sleeping on park benches, using newspapers as a blanket. She learned the survival codes of the invisible city, the unexpected kindness of other homeless people who shared what little they had. But the physical toll was immense. She grew thin, her clothes became ragged, and exhaustion became her constant companion. The hunger and cold were hard, but the deepest pain was the betrayal of her own body, which still produced milk, a cruel reminder of the son she had lost and the baby she had been forced to abandon. While Olivia fought for survival, the mansion had transformed into a hell of sound and pain. Without her, Theo regressed to a state of continuous despair. His cries, now higher-pitched and more inconsolable, echoed day and night, a lament that neither luxury nor the best professionals could silence. In a panic, Arthur hired the most expensive and experienced nannies in the city, one after another. But they all failed. The baby rejected them, refused the bottle, his little body writhing in an agony no one understood. He didn't want substitutes. He wanted the only person who had made him feel safe. "This boy is suffering from deep trauma," the last nanny said before quitting. "He's grieving." Arthur watched helplessly as his son wasted away. The joy he'd barely had time to know now, a distant, painful memory. The house, once cold, was now an environment of torture, his son's incessant crying a constant reminder of the mistake he had made. Every one of Theo's sobs was an echo of Arthur's cowardice, a soundtrack to his failure as a father. He had traded his son's peace for the approval of a world that now watched him in silence, waiting for his next move. The crisis reached its breaking point when Theo, losing weight dangerously, had to be hospitalized. The pediatrician's verdict was a final blow to Arthur's conscience. "Physically, there's nothing wrong with him," the doctor said after a battery of tests. "The problem is emotional. He's wasting away from sadness, Arthur. The technical term is non-organic failure to thrive. In layman's terms, babies can stop developing and even die from a broken heart." The doctor's words transformed Arthur's mistake from a failure of judgment into a potential death sentence for his own son. It was then that the doctor asked the question he could no longer avoid. Has there been any recent loss in his life? The loss of a primary attachment figure? Someone who was the center of his world? Faced with the direct question, Arthur could no longer hide behind his pride or his fear. The truth came out in a whisper of pure guilt. I fired his caregiver." The look on the doctor's face, a mixture of pity and reproach, was the mirror that finally showed Arthur the monstrosity of his act. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had been cruel. Returning to the silent mansion, now without even his son's cries, Arthur broke down. Theo's absence was even more terrifying than his pain. He walked mechanically to the baby's room and found a small rattle Olivia had left behind. As he picked up the simple object, the dam of his denial burst. He understood with devastating clarity what he had done. He hadn't fired an employee. He had ripped away from his son the only source of love and security the boy had ever known. He had sacrificed Theo's happiness and health on the altar of others' opinions. Guilt consumed him, but it did not paralyze him. For the first time in his life, Arthur allowed himself to feel the pain in its entirety, without the distractions of work or money, and from that place of absolute regret, a new purpose was born. His transformation began there, at rock bottom. Driven by a burning guilt, he began a desperate search for Olivia. He knew he had to find her, not just to save his son, but to save himself. The search for her became a journey for his own lost humanity, an act of penance. The man who once lived in an ivory tower now walked the most forgotten corners of the city. Shelters, church soup kitchens, dark alleys. He showed her picture, taken from security cameras, to anonymous faces he would have never noticed before. Each day of the search was a lesson in humility. He, who had judged Olivia so easily, now saw up close the harsh reality of social invisibility. Every "I don't know her," he heard, was a reminder of the world she came from and the one he had thrown her back into. After 10 days of fruitless searching, as hope was beginning to fade, a tip led him to an overpass in the center of the city. There, In a makeshift camp of cardboard and tarps, he found her. Olivia was unrecognizable, thin, frail, and burning with fever. With infinite care, he took her in his arms and carried her to the same luxury hospital where his son was fading. For 3 days, as her infection was treated, he never left her side, watching over her as she slept, whispering apologies she couldn't hear. When she was strong enough, he took her in a wheelchair to Theo's room. The moment she whispered, "Hi, my love," the baby, who had been listless for weeks, opened his eyes, recognized her voice, and for the first time since she had left, he smiled. The reunion was a silent miracle. With Theo visibly recovering with every hour he spent by her side, Arthur made his plea. "Olivia, please come home, not as my employee. Come back to be Theo's mother. Come back to be our family." She looked at him, the pain of betrayal still in her eyes, but also seeing the genuine repentance of a changed man. "I'll come back," she said, her voice weak but firm. "But I'm coming back for him. Your trust, Arthur. You'll have to earn it back every single day from scratch." It wasn't a fairy tale ending with instant forgiveness. It was the beginning of a slow, difficult reconstruction, a new contract based not on a salary, but on the promise of a second chance. And for Arthur, that was the only penance that mattered. Sergio woke up that morning with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Fear had been replaced by an unshakable determination. His first call was to his communications director. "Regina, schedule a press conference for 3 p.m., all the major outlets." The second was to his family. When his sister Monica and his brother Flavio arrived, he announced his plan. "I'm going to publicly declare my love for Vanessa and ask her to marry me." The reaction was furious. They threatened to disinherit him, to ruin his reputation. Sergio listened to them with an icy calm. "If our family name is synonymous with prejudice, then I'd rather no longer be a part of it." At 3 p.m., before a packed auditorium of journalists, Sergio Noronha stepped up to the podium. He didn't talk about business. He talked about love, cowardice, and redemption. He told the whole story, unfiltered. Vanessa's heroism, the media's cruelty, the pressure from his own social class, and most importantly, his own shameful mistake in sending her away. "I gave in to fear," he said, his voice thick with emotion, looking directly into the cameras. "But today, I choose love." He took a deep breath. "I love Vanessa Lima, and I am on my way, right this second, to ask her to marry me. Let the world judge as it will." At the hospital, Vanessa watched it all on a small TV in the break room, surrounded by her co-workers. She saw the man she loved risk his empire, his name, and his social standing for her. When he declared his love to the entire country, she collapsed in tears of disbelief and redemption. He wasn't just calling her back, he was honoring her, defending her, elevating her. He was proving with the most public and courageous act possible that she was not his shame, but his pride. The proof her daughter said she deserved. He didn't go home. He drove straight to the hospital, striding through the disinfectant-scented hallways, followed by a wave of murmurs and recording cell phones. He found her in the laundry room, still in a state of shock, folding sheets. "Vanessa," he said, his voice soft. Before the astonished gazes of dozens of employees, the billionaire Sergio Noronha knelt on the cold floor. He pulled from his pocket not an extravagant diamond, but a simple band. "I was a fool and a coward, but I love you more than I am afraid. Will you marry me and give me the chance to be the man you deserve?" Vanessa's world stood still. Everything she had lived through, all the pain, all the struggle, had led to this surreal moment. Looking into Sergio's eyes, she didn't see a billionaire, but a man who had fought his own demons and won. She saw a future. "Yes," she whispered, her tears now of pure happiness. "Yes, I will." The hospital laundry room erupted in applause. The video of the proposal, recorded on dozens of phones, went viral instantly, but this time the narrative was different. It wasn't a scandal, it was the most beautiful and unlikely love story the country had ever seen. 6 months later, the mansion in Greenwich was the setting for a wedding that celebrated the union of two worlds. Felipe, fully recovered and beaming, was the ring bearer, and in the middle of the ceremony he ran to the microphone and shouted, "This is my mum Vanessa, and now it's forever." Alice and Manuela, the bridesmaids, looked at their mother with an overflowing pride. Even the Noronha family was there, Monica and Flavio, touched by the authenticity of the couple's love, and Felipe's undeniable happiness, asked for forgiveness and were welcomed back into the new family nucleus. Their story became a legend, a modern fairy tale that proved that true love is stronger than class prejudice. Sergio discovered that his greatest wealth wasn't in his stocks, but in the sound of Felipe's laughter, in the dreams of Alice and Manuela, and in the touch of Vanessa's hand in his. Vanessa, in turn, understood that the tragedy that took her son Gustavo wasn't an end point, but a painful comma that prepared her for a new chapter of love and healing. By saving a life, she not only found a new love, she saved herself, forgiving herself for the guilt that had haunted her for a decade. A story that proves the courage to love is the most powerful force in the world. Do you believe true love can overcome all barriers? Leave your opinion in the comments, like if you were rooting for this happy ending, and subscribe to get our emotional stories every day. Tomorrow's could be yours.